If you like our stories, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. Alice hadn't planned on coming back. When the letter arrived, scrawled in her great-aunt Esther's unmistakable spidery handwriting, she felt an old, uneasy pull. Unfinished business. Secrets unearthed. Her hands trembled as she opened it, reading the sparse words that informed her that Esther had left her the lake house. There was no parting wisdom, just a brittle deed. It felt more like a summons than an inheritance. And she'd barely slept the night before the drive, heart pounding as she thought of that old house by the lake. The following day, she found herself at the edge of a long driveway winding through woods that darkened as she drove further in. When the trees parted, the lake house loomed before her, silent and gray, cradled by the forest and shadowed by a sky that seemed perpetually dim. The lake itself lay smooth and dark as glass, stretching out beyond the house, a surface still and unbroken, as if holding its breath. She stepped out of her car, shivering slightly, struck by how the air held a damp chill even though it was summer. She had memories of this place, distant but sharp, like all childhood memories. Summers spent at the lake, when she would glimpse strange shapes moving in the water, feel chills from cold drafts in sunlit rooms, and listen to Esther's warnings not to wander alone after dark. There was always something shadowed about the place, and Esther's warnings had cemented it in Alice's mind as a place both magical and dangerous. The house looked just as she remembered it, smaller, darker, and held in shadows that seemed to have deepened over the years. Dust floated in beams of weak daylight spilling through cracked windows, and cobwebs hung in every corner. Alice felt as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. She pushed open the front door, the scent of old wood and stale air surrounding her as she stepped inside. The quiet rooms were ghostly, each holding remnants of another time. In the sitting room, Esther's armchair still faced the lake, its fabric worn and faded. Alice could almost see her great-aunt sitting there, gazing out at the water, her back straight and her hands clenched in her lap. Haunted by memories Alice had never understood. She recalled a moment from her childhood. She had once asked Esther, "What do you see out there, Aunt Esther?" She had asked innocently, but Esther's response had been far from lighthearted. "Some things," she replied in a whisper, "are better left unseen." The memory of her aunt's haunted expression lingered as Alice stared out the same window, watching shadows ripple across the lake's surface, a feeling of unease settling deep into her bones. The lake was still and eerie, its surface like dark glass, a reflection of sky and trees warped into strange shapes. Alice turned away from it, shaking off the strange feeling of being watched. That night, the silence in the house was oppressive. Alice lay awake, listening to every creak, every groan of the old house as it settled around her. She'd come here to escape her life for a while, to clear her mind, but something about the place felt unsettling, a wrongness she couldn't quite explain. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, thick and absolute, as though the lake and woods were closing in, watching her from outside with an intensity that was both unnerving and inescapable. Around midnight, she heard the first knock. Sharp and deliberate, it sliced through the silence, freezing her in place. She sat up, her heart pounding, straining to hear. Then came a second knock, closer this time, from outside her window. She held her breath, staring into the darkness, half expecting to see a face peering back at her from the other side. After a tense, breathless minute, she crept to the window, her hands shaking as she pulled back the curtain. Outside, the lake lay still and silent, reflecting only the faint glow of the moon, with no sign of anything or anyone. Nothing. She told herself it was just the wind, or perhaps the old house settling after years of neglect. But the knock returned the next night, and the one after that, as steady as a heartbeat. Each time it came closer, more insistent, as though it were a summons she couldn't ignore. Something was drawing her outside, pulling her toward the lake, and each night, just before dawn, she would glimpse a faint shadow by the water, standing at the shore, barely visible but unmistakably human. She could have sworn it grew nearer each time, lingering just at the edge of sight as if it too were watching her. On the third night, unable to sleep, she ventured into the attic. The narrow stairs creaked, and the attic itself was a labyrinth of forgotten memories. Old trunks, furniture shrouded in sheets, and shelves cluttered with dusty knickknacks. She moved carefully, her footsteps muffled by the dust and shadows. In a corner, she found an old photograph tucked beneath a pile of yellowed linens. In the photo, her great-aunt Esther stood with a group of people by the lake, all dressed in outdated clothes. But in the background, almost blurred, was a young woman with dark hair and an intense, defiant stare that seemed to pierce through the decades. Alice felt a strange pang of recognition, like a memory tugging at the edge of her mind, a feeling that something about the woman was familiar, even though she couldn't place why. The next day, she ventured into town, hoping to learn more about the house's history. But the townspeople were tight-lipped, their faces turning grim when she mentioned the lake. An old man who ran the hardware store gave her a piercing look. "Bad things happen up there," he muttered, his voice rough and low, his eyes clouded with memories. Esther should have let that house rot. But no one would explain further, and the more Alice pressed, the colder the looks became. A woman at the grocery store looked at her with pity. "That house holds secrets, miss," she whispered, her eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear. "Some secrets are best left buried." Back at the house, Alice felt the weight of their words pressing down on her. Secrets buried beneath the lake's still surface, secrets that had lingered long after Esther's death. She began searching through Esther's belongings, hoping to find answers. Alice spent the afternoon going through old drawers and closets, hoping to find anything that might explain the townspeople's ominous warnings. Upstairs, she noticed a small locked drawer in a chest in the attic. Digging around, she found a tarnished key that fit, and when she opened the drawer, she discovered a strange collection of items. A locket, dulled with age, a silver comb, and a small notebook filled with Esther's tight, slanted handwriting. The comb had strands of dark hair tangled in it, which made Alice's skin crawl. But it was the notebook that drew her in. She opened the notebook and flipped through the pages, each entry more erratic and fearful than the last. Her great-aunt had dated the entries, marking each one with strange notations. "Nightfall, waiting by the lake, she knows." The further she read, the more she felt Esther's terror coming off the pages like a chill. "June 12, 1975. I saw her again tonight by the lake. She just stands there watching me. Her eyes are hollow, accusing. She knows. She knows what I did." Alice's pulse quickened as she read the words. They were filled with a terror so raw, so desperate, that she could almost feel it seeping from the page, as though her aunt's fear had been pressed into the pages. She scanned through more entries, piecing together fragments of a life lived in fear. Esther seemed convinced she was being haunted by her younger sister, Lily. A sister who had vanished one summer evening in 1968. Her body never recovered, her fate a mystery. The townspeople had called it an accident, some mishap on the lake, a tragedy never to be spoken of again. But Esther's journal told a different story, one of guilt and shadows, of whispers that would echo through the empty rooms long after she was gone. "Lily knows," Esther had written over and over. "She waits by the water watching." Alice felt her skin prickle as she turned the pages. Each entry grew more erratic, more desperate, as though Esther had been unraveling one thread at a time, trapped in a prison of her own making. Her words became fragmented, paranoid, until they were almost incoherent. There were sketches, crude but disturbing, of a woman's face, eyes dark and hollow, staring out from the lake. It was as though her aunt had fallen apart, page by page, each entry taking her closer to the edge of madness. Alice's mind reeled. The knocks she had heard each night, the shadow by the lake. Had it all been real? Was Esther's torment still lingering, waiting for her? She felt a surge of dread as she looked back through the journal, her hands trembling as she searched for answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The attic felt too silent, too still, as if it too were holding its breath. Shadows crept along the walls as the light faded, and she heard faint whispers drifting up from downstairs. But when she listened closely, the house was silent. She stayed in the attic until dark, searching through old trunks and boxes, hoping to find anything that would shed more light on the strange entries. She found letters, some of them faded with age, detailing family business and a few photos of Lily. Though in all of them, her face was either turned away or shadowed. It was as if Esther had avoided taking any photos that captured her sister's gaze directly, as if her eyes had held something Esther feared would linger. Alice read the journal late into the night, and with each entry, a picture began to form. Lily had been troubled. She had strange beliefs, Esther had written once, about the lake's power, about the dark secrets it kept. Esther's entries suggested that Lily had once insisted she had a connection to the lake, that she could feel something pulling her toward it. She'd even told Esther that the lake knows everything we keep inside. The words felt more like a curse than a belief, and Alice found herself reading them over and over as the house around her seemed to grow colder. Unable to shake the dread, Alice went down to the lake that evening, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. The lake's surface was calm, almost eerily still, as though it too were holding a secret it didn't want her to know. As she approached the water's edge, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She stood there, staring into the lake's depths, her reflection barely visible in the twilight, and felt a strange sensation of being watched, as if something beneath the water was staring back at her. Then, in the dim glow of dusk, she saw it. A figure standing on the opposite shore, just as Esther had described in her journal. Pale and still, it wore a dress that seemed to float like smoke, its face shadowed but unmistakably human. And as Alice stared, the figure raised a hand in a slow, deliberate motion, a gesture that felt like a warning, or perhaps an invitation. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, as though the gaze of the figure had burned into her soul. She turned and fled back to the house, slamming the door behind her and locking it, her breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. She tried to calm herself, telling herself that it was just her imagination, that she was exhausted, that the shadows were only tricks of the mind. But that night, she couldn't sleep, haunted by the image of the figure by the lake, its gaze piercing into her even as she lay alone in the dark. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak became a whisper, and she could have sworn she heard footsteps coming from the direction of the lake, approaching the house. The air grew colder, heavy with a presence that she couldn't see but could feel, pressing down on her chest. The next day, her curiosity outweighed her fear. She went to the town library, hoping the archives would have something to offer. After hours of searching, she found what she was looking for. Buried in an old newspaper clipping from 1968. Lily Shaw, 21, vanished under mysterious circumstances. Last seen near the family's lake house. Search efforts were called off after 2 weeks when no trace of her was found. The clipping said little, only that her death had been ruled accidental. The lake was dangerous, authorities had said, easy to slip into without a trace. But the locals had their own theories, Alice realized, and she could see now why they'd been so cautious with her. As she left the library, she felt the weight of their words again, the sense of secrets unspoken. She felt their eyes on her as she passed, pitying looks that chilled her. Back at the lake house, she felt as if the walls were closing in, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting. She returned to the attic, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain, and found herself standing before Esther's dresser, her fingers tracing the edge of its old chipped wood. In a moment of impulsiveness, she pulled the drawers open, rifling through old clothes and papers until she found a hidden compartment at the bottom. Inside was a locket, tarnished and cold, with a lock of dark hair and a single faded note. "Forgive me." Alice stood by the shore, feeling the weight of the locket pressing into her palm, its cold metal biting into her skin. The lake stretched out before her, its surface like black glass, smooth and unyielding, refusing to reveal the secrets hidden beneath. The faint light of dawn cast a silvery glow over the water, and for a moment, Alice could almost believe that everything was normal, that the lake was just a lake, the house just a house. But the feeling faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by a deep sense of unease, as though the air itself were charged with something dark and watchful. A voice echoed in her mind, low and urgent, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. She clenched the locket, feeling as though it were the only thing anchoring her, the only barrier between her and whatever waited in the lake's depths. She tried to remember Esther's words, the way her aunt had warned her to stay away from the water, to never venture out alone after dark. But those warnings felt distant now, like memories from a dream, blurred and faded by time. Alice's gaze drifted across the lake, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine as her eyes settled on a spot near the far shore. The water there seemed darker, thicker somehow, as though something were lurking just below the surface. She took a step closer, her heart pounding, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Was Lily's body down there, hidden beneath the water, trapped by secrets her aunt had taken to her grave? The thought sent a shiver through her, and she took a step back, her pulse quickening. She knew she should leave, should go back to the house, lock herself inside and forget she had ever seen that dark patch in the water. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was calling to her, urging her to come closer, to uncover whatever lay hidden in its depths. With a deep breath, Alice closed her eyes, clutching the locket tightly. She could feel the cold metal pressing into her palm, grounding her, anchoring her to the present. She whispered a silent prayer, hoping that it would be enough to protect her from whatever waited beneath the surface. When she opened her eyes, the lake was still, its surface calm, but the dark patch of water lingered, unmoving, like a shadow that refused to fade. Alice turned and hurried back to the house, her footsteps quick and unsteady, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the lake's gaze pressing down on her, as though it were watching her, waiting for her to return. She tried to shake off the feeling, to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the weight remained, heavy and insistent, following her all the way back to the house. Inside, she locked the door behind her, leaning against it as she caught her breath. The house felt colder than before, its silence thicker, almost oppressive. She glanced around, half expecting to see shadows moving in the corners, but the room was empty. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at her, refusing to let go. She went to the attic, feeling safer there than anywhere else in the house. The dusty room was filled with forgotten relics, each item a piece of her family's past, a reminder of the secrets they had buried. She sat down on an old trunk, clutching the locket as she stared out the small, dusty window, her gaze fixed on the lake. The hours passed slowly, the weight of the house pressing down on her, the silence thick and suffocating. She could feel the presence of her aunt, lingering in the shadows, watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. She closed her eyes, exhaustion tugging at her, pulling her into a restless sleep. Her dreams were dark and fragmented, filled with images of the lake, of Lily standing by the shore, her face pale and hollow, her eyes dark and accusing. In her dream, Lily reached out, her hand pointing towards something hidden beneath the water, something that pulsed with a dark, unseen power. Alice tried to look away, but she couldn't. She was trapped, held by Lily's gaze, forced to stare into the depths of the lake. She woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat, her heart racing. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the room, and the house was silent, too silent, as though it were holding its breath. She took a deep, shaky breath, her hands trembling as she clutched the locket. She could feel the weight of her aunt's presence, lingering in the shadows, watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. Determined to find answers, Alice went back to the journal, flipping through the pages with shaky hands. She found an entry near the back, written in a shaky hand that seemed almost unrecognizable, as though Esther's fear had twisted her writing into something jagged and unnatural. July 3rd, 1975. She comes every night now, standing by the lake, waiting. I can't escape her. She knows what I did. She knows what's hidden beneath the water. The words sent a chill through Alice, her skin prickling as she read them over and over. Esther's guilt was palpable, each word a testament to the fear that had haunted her, a fear that had grown stronger with each passing day. It was clear now that Esther had been tormented by more than just memories. She had been haunted by the knowledge of what she had done, by the weight of secrets that had refused to stay buried. Alice closed the journal, her mind racing. The lake held a curse, a dark power that had claimed her aunt, twisting her mind, consuming her with guilt and regret. And now that curse was reaching out for her, pulling her toward the lake, urging her to uncover its secrets. With a sense of dread, Alice went downstairs, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the walls closing in as though they too held memories too dark to bear. She knew she should leave, should get in her car and drive away, but something kept her rooted to the spot, a pull she couldn't resist. As the night deepened, Alice felt an overwhelming urge to return to the lake. She slipped outside, her footsteps silent on the damp grass, the locket clutched tightly in her hand. The lake was dark, its surface like glass, reflecting the faint glow of the moon. She stood at the shore, staring into the water, her heart pounding as she imagined what lay hidden beneath the surface. She took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the dark patch of water near the far shore. She could feel the pull of the lake, drawing her closer, urging her to uncover the truth. With trembling hands, she crouched down, reaching out to touch the water, her fingers brushing the surface. A chill raced through her, and in that moment, she saw Lily's face, pale and cold, staring up at her from the depths, her eyes filled with accusation. Alice jerked back, gasping for breath, her heart pounding as though she had seen a ghost. She staggered to her feet, clutching the locket to her chest, feeling as though she had crossed a line, as though she had ventured too close to something she wasn't meant to find. Alice stumbled back toward the house, her pulse racing, her breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. She could still feel the weight of Lily's gaze, as if her sister's spirit lingered, watching her from the depths of the lake. As she reached the house, she slammed the door behind her, locking it, her back pressed against the wood as though she could block out the presence pressing in from outside. The silence in the house felt oppressive, heavy, as if the very walls were closing in around her. She made her way upstairs, her footsteps echoing in the quiet, feeling as though she were being followed. Shadows seemed to shift in her periphery, sliding along the walls, and she could have sworn she heard whispers drifting through the hallways, faint and indistinct, like voices from a dream. She gripped the locket tighter, clutching it to her chest as though it could protect her. Back in the attic, Alice found herself drawn once again to the small window overlooking the lake. She peered outside, her gaze settling on the dark patch of water where she had seen Lily's face, her skin prickling with the sense that the lake itself was watching her, waiting for her to return. The locket in her hand felt heavier now, as if it held more than just a strand of hair. Something deeper, something darker, as if it were imbued with her aunt's guilt, with the weight of secrets that had festered in this place for decades. Alice's mind raced with fragments of memories, visions of her aunt sitting by the lake, her gaze distant and haunted, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She thought of the journal, the way Esther's entries had grown more fragmented, more frantic, as though her aunt had been driven to the edge of madness by the weight of her own guilt. And now, Alice realized, she was beginning to feel the same pull, the same urge to return to the lake, to uncover whatever lay hidden beneath its dark surface. She sat down on the old dusty trunk, staring out at the lake as night fell, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. The hours passed slowly, each one stretching out into an eternity as the weight of the house pressed down on her, the silence thick and suffocating. She could feel her aunt's presence lingering in the shadows, watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. Finally, as midnight approached, she could resist no longer. She slipped out of the attic, making her way downstairs, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. She moved through the house in a trance, barely aware of her surroundings as she stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around her like a shroud. She felt the pull of the lake, stronger now, urging her forward, guiding her down to the shore. The lake was dark, its surface like black glass, reflecting the faint glow of the moon. She stood at the water's edge, clutching the locket in her hand, her heart pounding as she stared into the depths, feeling as though she were staring into the very heart of the darkness that had haunted her family for generations. With trembling hands, she opened the locket, staring down at the strand of hair it held. It was dark, almost black, and as she looked at it, she felt a strange sense of connection, as though she were holding a piece of her aunt's soul, a fragment of the guilt that had consumed her. She crouched down, reaching out to touch the water, her fingers brushing the surface. A chill raced through her, and in that moment she saw it. Lily's face, pale and hollow, staring up at her from the depths, her eyes filled with accusation. Her mouth moved, forming words that Alice couldn't hear, but the message was clear. "You know what you must do." Alice staggered back, gasping for breath, her heart pounding as though she had been pulled from a nightmare. She clutched the locket to her chest, feeling its cold metal pressing into her skin, anchoring her, grounding her. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't leave, couldn't abandon the lake house until she had uncovered the truth, until she had put her family's ghost to rest. With a sense of dread, she made her way back to the house, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her mind racing with fragments of memories, pieces of the past that had been buried for too long. She felt the weight of her aunt's presence pressing down on her, guiding her, urging her to finish what Esther had started. Back inside, Alice went to the fireplace, her hands shaking as she lit a match and held it to the pages of Esther's journal. The paper caught quickly, the flames consuming the words, the memories, the guilt that had haunted her family for so long. She watched as the journal burned, the flames casting eerie shadows across the walls, and she felt a strange sense of relief, as though she were finally freeing herself from the weight of her aunt's secrets. As the last of the journal turned to ash, Alice felt a chill pass through the room, and for a moment she thought she heard a voice, a faint whisper, drifting through the air like smoke. She closed her eyes, clutching the locket tightly, and whispered a silent prayer for her aunt, for Lily, for herself. She could feel their presence lingering, watching her, but the weight of their gaze felt lighter now, as though the lake had finally released them from its grasp. In the quiet that followed, Alice felt a sense of peace settle over her, a calm that she hadn't felt since she had first arrived. She knew that the lake house would always hold its secrets, its shadows, but she felt no fear, no dread. She had uncovered the truth, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the curse that had haunted her family for generations. As dawn broke over the lake, casting its first light across the water, Alice walked down to the shore one last time. She stood there, gazing out at the still, silent lake, feeling the weight of her family's legacy fade with each passing moment. She dropped the locket into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface, disappearing into the depths. For the first time, the lake felt peaceful, its surface calm, unbroken. The shadows had lifted, and as Alice turned to leave, she felt a sense of closure, of release. She had put the ghost to rest, and now she could finally go home.